So Minnesota Congressman Dean Phillips cites Biden's age as one of the reasons. He's 2 years older or younger than Donald Trump, who's acting crazier, but okay. One of the reasons he launched a primary challenge against the president for the Democratic presidential nomination. Phillips appeared on HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher on Friday, where he pointed out Biden's sagging poll numbers and encouraged others to pursue primary challenges as well.
We both struggle with the same thing. We like Joe Biden, right?
Absolutely.
And we think he's done a good job.
A wonderful job.
Okay. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg did a good job.
Outstanding.
But did not know when to quit.
Yes.
And that's why you're here.
That's why I'm here.
Okay.
83% of Democrats under 30 want a different nominee.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of politicians lie, but the numbers don't. The more the merrier. It's still not too late to jump into this race. I wish we had more competition instead of a coronation. This is not that difficult, and I don't understand why people are so hesitant to do what the country needs so desperately.
Well, I mean, I think it's kind of obvious, John Del Volpe, why they might be hesitant. I mean, first of all, Joe Biden has beaten Trump. Can you name someone, even on the Republican side, who has done that? No. Okay, so that's number one by far. Secondly, his presidency, whether you appreciate his policies or not, has been one of the most robust in terms of its accomplishments in modern history. So I'd be nervous about being the Democrat who wants to take the race away from him and be the person who loses to Donald Trump. Who wants to do that?
Mika, I think to put the polls into some context, I mean, there's certainly a series of signs that the 2020 coalition is weakening. However, the fact that younger people are roughly within the margin of error in a lot of these swing states, according to the New York Times poll yesterday, the optimistic person would say that, as you indicated, President Biden has, I believe, led the most youth-forward accomplishments in a generation. $127 billion in student debt, significant progress on gun violence, on climate change, the largest investment in climate change, on marijuana reform, and a host of other issues. So the opportunity, I think, over the course of the next year, when the campaign spends hundreds of millions of dollars for communicating these issues, there's an opportunity to obviously kind of, improve those numbers with one of the kind of the underperformance segments being young people who just haven't tuned in. The problem that I hear from younger people is this growing level of cynicism over the last several months, even on the back of the 2022 midterm election, which was so favorable for Democrats. And they think of this time as kind of the opposite of Reagan's trickle-down theory, where the problems, the wars, the challenges, the other generations are now trickling down on their shoulders. They are the most vulnerable in having to deal with that. And that's something that has them questioning, at this point, who's the best candidate, kind of whether it's a third party or whether it's the president to move this agenda forward. But I do think that once the campaign moves to talk about those accomplishments, things could hopefully change.
I mean, I just, Jonathan Lemire, it's so interesting because when Donald Trump won the presidency, most people could not envision what his leadership would look like. But we now know what his leadership looks like. And part of his leadership would be the overturning of Roe for a million different reasons, along with the help of Leonard Leo. So I'm trying to imagine voters in the voting booth, most of them, especially Democrats, moderate Republicans, or anybody who likes this country, who wouldn't make a decision for America, because that would be the decision ultimately when you get in there. For America. For women's rights. We know where most of the country stands on abortion and women's health care. So why wouldn't they make that vote for women's rights? Because that would be a vote for Biden. Wouldn't they want to make a vote for democracy? Because, again, that's the difference between these two candidates. It's not like different policy differences and this and that. It's literally for or against democracy, for fairness, for humanity, for empathy. How about for leadership in the world, or even an effective presidency, if you want to think deeply, that works on a bipartisan basis? That, again, is a vote for Biden and not for Donald Trump, who may be going to prison. I know I'm preaching, but at the same time, Isn't that the choice? And then how do you explain these poll numbers?
Yeah, Trump is a rarity because he is running for president, not an incumbent, but has a presidential record. So we know what a Trump presidency looks like. We also have seen his very public conduct since then. January 6th, the criminal cases and the like. And it's certainly been the Biden theory of the case, his White House, that when it comes to a binary choice in the privacy of a voting booth next fall, people, especially independents and swing voters who decide elections, can't bring themselves to vote for Donald Trump, and they will for Joe Biden. But the problem that Democrats have right now is getting those people motivated to go to the polls at all. That yes, if they go, maybe they'll vote for Biden. But if they see at this moment they don't see much of a difference, or they're unhappy with Biden, they're unhappy for Trump, everything's bad, well, maybe they stay home. And we know that Trump supporters feverishly are going to run and turn out. So, Reverend Al Sharpton, to expand on Mika's point here a little bit, we know what a Donald Trump presidency would look like. We also know, because he's telling us, what another 4 years of Donald Trump would be like if he were to take office again. The Biden camp has, they're not talking about the criminal cases. They feel like that'd be inappropriate because they want to separate White House and DOJ. They've started to draw some more contrasts recently in terms of what Biden versus Trump, not just selling Biden positive accomplishments, but also taking on Trump, highlighting Trump's negatives. What would your advice to be? What should be their approach?
Well, I think that Walter really laid it out in a way that strikes me as the core of my concern, and that is that we're not looking at a normal election. We've never had a presidential candidate who was president that's under 4 indictments, 91 felonies, and a civil case. Now, that I'm not just talking about on the surface. I'm talking about we're redefining what is appropriate and what is within the norms of American politics. So those that want to support Trump are really saying we need to refashion what a candidate, what a president ought to be. We're talking about a guy that a judge has already said has done frauds, and he's tied in any state or ahead in any state. So I think it's about what are the norms. We've always debated abortion, affirmative action, and other. But we're debating whether or not there are guardrails in American politics now, and whether or not a president can take office that has already said, I'm going to arrest and prosecute my enemies. And I think Mika said it best. It's voting for America as we know it and what it's supposed to stand for, or voting for something else that we don't know. It may be made up in the back of some card playing room by Donald Trump. That's what this election is really about.
I want to turn it back to you, which is, I've just heard what the Reverend Sharpton said, which is all these indictments. And yet every time there's an indictment, it seems that Trump's numbers go up. Do you think, and I know you're a pollster, not a prognosticator, that a conviction would finally break the bubble or something? Or is this something that's immutable in these supporters?
I think that certainly is uncharted territory, but I do think in this current moment, perhaps we're spending too much time talking about the convictions and not enough time talking about what happened from January 2017 to January 2021, which is that record.
Yes.
And when we speak to, again, younger voters, that's the record that made them turn out in record numbers in 2020 and in 2022 and also in 2018. And what young voters in particular, which I think is going to be critical, and it's interconnected with race as well, a critical voting bloc, is they've seen basically kind of a series of rights being pulled away. And the messages that I hear in focus groups, and I've done dozens of them the last year, is that we keep on voting and we keep on getting our rights taken away. So therefore, they're not believing in the system. So what I would say is, for Democrats out there, they need to recognize that. They need to help people see that through politics and government, we can have some renewed stability in this country, and that President Biden can be a peacemaker, both domestically as well as around the world. And that's what young people are looking for. They want to feel good about their president and the country.